So there. This is Mae Brussell. This, as I said before, is KAZUFM, Pacific Grove, California. And this is program number 595. It's May the 2nd, 1983, and the year is almost half over. Can you believe that one? It's hard to believe. Okay. A year ago this evening, what were we talking about? What was I talking about on World Watchers? That was May 2nd, 1982. I was explaining again the importance of the Falklands and Antarctica, the testing ground for space stations, a quotation from National Geographic in 1968. The Board of Trustees of National Geographic, Chief Justice Earl Warren of the Warren Commission, Juan Tripp of Pan Am, and talking about the political appointees going down the board of directors of National Geographic. An article that was in National Geographic about Antarctica having its own atomic energy, how they have fresh water down there, the importance of Antarctica to the general conspiratorial theme and the hope eventually put in many books of the use of Antarctica for space stations and the belief that it is used by many people down there already, and the closeness of Antarctica to Argentina. And he was talking about the Minsk radio factory and the connections of Lee and Marina Oswald to Argentina a year ago, and also saying, watch out for Alexander Haig, that he was under attack. And of course, shortly after that week, when he came home from England in June of 1982, he was taken out of the cabinet position by Ronald Reagan. He was playing a double-dealing game back and forth between the Argentina people. He's close to Licio Gelli, who was down there at the time, who had fled from Italy for various tax scandals running into the billions of dollars, and because of the Masonic Lodge scandal, the International Nazi Odessa Network. At the time last year, J. Peter Grace was under fire. He was given a position to investigate for the United States government ways to cut costs for the government. I haven't had a chance yet to put on this program his conclusions, which are horrendous, but maybe I'll do that next week or so. He figured out how to cut costs. That's pretty good. This last week, May 3rd, 1983, I had this story in National Examiner. They put the title wrong. Did FBI program assassin to kill John Lennon? It was actually the CIA COINTEL program. The FBI is part of that operation, but they do other things in terms of not investigating these conspiracies and Mark David Chapman, but it was the Defense Department that traveled Mr. Mark David Chapman around more than the FBI. But that was in the National Examiner last week. They come and go so fast. If you don't have it, write to me, self-addressed stamped envelope, and I'll send you a copy of the article. Also, I made a mistake last week. I offered copies of the article on Hitler's escape to Antarctica. That's 50 pages, and it costs $10 with the postage and envelope to cover it. And I forgot to say that is the cost that it is for me to have these copied, unless somebody can think of a way to get it done cheaper. I do have to charge for copying and for mailing those out. The Sunday London Times last Sunday, April 24th, had a front page story. It was right under the Hitler diary that we're going into in a few minutes. It was a huge story. It was 1¼ inches large on the front page. Sophia Link snaps. This is the story. The Italian legal authorities now admit there is no decisive proof involving Sergej Antonov, Antonov, a Bulgarian airline employee in the plot to kill the Pope 2 years ago. His release is believed to be imminent, according to writer George Armstrong. Antonov was arrested solely on the testimony of Ali Aja, the Turk serving a life sentence for the shooting, who was promised he'd get a lighter sentence if he told who he worked with. So he picked a KGB Bulgarian connection, and then the headlines carried it for months and months. I have a mile of articles on it, one on top of the other, a pile of them, and just a little story now coming out. As soon as they made the connections of Aja to the Central Intelligence Agency, and we're going to bring home the agents of the CIA because they were involved and were exposed, then the London Times finally had a story. The links are broken in this story. Also, another story from the San Francisco Examiner, a secret cabal in arms, drugs, assassinations. This has to do with the same revelations coming out now. A global ring in arms, drug, and assassinations. Milan, Italy, the world's most powerful underground arms ring, is operated from northern Italy. Now, this is the story that broke in November of 1982 about Henry Arsan, Henriarsan. But one thing it leaves out of this story, because it's written by Bernard D. Kaplan, he's the Michael Ledeen. He's taking over Ledeen's job now. He talks about the big plot and tells a lot in the story, but he doesn't mention in the story that Arsan's offices were in Banco Ambrosiano, where Roberta Calvi was the president of the bank, the fellow that was hung in London last June. And his secretary went flying out the window last June. But he says the smuggling ring sounds like something drawn from a James Bond thriller. A secret organization staffed partially by former intelligence agents. Now, that's pretty good. They're getting into the intelligence of Italy. They furnish the most modern deadly weapons to the highest bidder. In addition, they have connections with international drug traffickers and planners of the 1981 assassination attempt on the Pope. So they have a secret organization, the assassination of the Pope, northern Italy in Milan, and he mentions Mr. Arsan. Evidence seized earlier this month, this is in April, by the Italians investigating this case points to the ring's existence. And the important thing about this story is that the newspaper in Italy said that 20 missiles were offered by this arms ring with a route down to Argentina at the time that Argentina was fighting Great Britain in the Falklands, and they link possibly with the knowledge of the French Secret Service. So you have intelligence agents and the French Secret Service. Palermo's probe, that's one of the judges looking into it, into the illicit arms trade, was said to involve several former Italian intelligence agents, as well as some from Western countries. That's your CIA, Italian intelligence, French Secret Service. Now we're getting a little more of this story. Okay, and they also have links to the Middle East. That's over to Lebanon with the drug traffic and so forth. Now they're linking the attempted assassination on the Pope to the French intelligence and the Italian intelligence. Recently, Palermo, the investigator, entered Bulgaria to interrogate one of the people involved in this. I've mentioned before, Mr. Selenk, C-E-L-E-N-K, Selenk. But they could only talk about drugs. The investigator could not ask him about assassinations. Now, that's the important thing, is that many people ask about one or two instances on the periphery, but it's the assassinations that I'm interested in and study, but they weren't allowed to ask the primary witness about the assassinations or weapon smuggling, because that's where the weapon for Ajak came from the Galen operation over in Germany. It was identified as coming from there and not from the KGB. In the past 3 years, this ring sold tens of millions of dollars worth of German-built Leopard tanks and Cobra helicopters to Iran. The Cobra helicopters are the Bell helicopters out of Fort Worth, the Texas area. Bell helicopter involved in permanent acts in the murder of John Kennedy. It says they used the Italian port of Genoa. Arsan was among 5 defendants to be sentenced. He got a sentence of 18 years in prison, a fine of $150,000. So that's pretty good for another story on the subject, making it a little closer to the truth. Now, there were 2 deaths, just one in February and one in April, that are linked to this and very important. One came from the London Observer. Last Paris payoff for the Napoleon of crime. That's Dapper Eddie Zeymur, Z-E-Y-M-U-R. He was gunned down in Florida, but he is part of the dope trade, and I might have mentioned his name on the air before. He's an important link to the international dope trade, the assassinations, and the gun running. So after the Ajah links began to come apart and fell to the CIA, then one of the top dogs who was in Miami was gunned down just in April. And so that he would be silenced. Another person who is important to this story is Lieutenant Colonel Nutt, N-U-T. This is a story, French murder probe, Saturday, March the 12th, 1983. The mystery surrounding the death of top French secret agent grew with speculation. Originally, there was a false suicide report, and then it turned out to be a murder. I'm going into the murder this week that was allegedly a suicide with a shotgun, but these murders followed right after the story began to become unglued, that where Ajah was lying and the gun was linking actually to the Galen organization in Germany. But this fellow was very close to, he was a French intelligence agent in Nice and in Cannes, who I believe has had the possible knowledge of also the Grace Kelly murder and the entanglement around the Monte Carlo area. A French intelligence agent was killed March 1983, and then in April we get the story that they indeed are getting to the French intelligence, the Americans, and the Italian intelligence, and that is the old Masonic Lodge group. And I think they had good reason to want the Pope dead. One, it would, as they said, it would be an act of war. They'd have an excuse to go into Poland and invade there. They could blame the KGB and heat up that Cold War and make it hotter. And two, Paul Marcinkus, who's hiding inside the Vatican, might get a reprieve if a new pope was brought in. They might let up the investigation because they were hot on Marcinkus's trail just at the time the pope was shot in May of 1981. Another story, April the 11th, 1983, new arrests in Italy, guns for drugs case. And this, again, goes back to the same case, the Italian Judge Palermo, the man responsible for investigating this case. He has arrested Carlo Bertoncini, Bertoncini, the head of a 6-man manufacturing company that sells parts to NATO for telecommunications, and another man, Vincenzo Giovanelli, Giovannelli. His first name is Vincenzo. He transport weapons to Naples to the NATO bases under the United States Navy contract. Now, those two men, plus several others, according to the article, are linked to the P2 Masonic Lodge, which is the International Odessa Nazi Network. And so they made 5 new arrests this last week on that case. So they are getting a little closer than we get when we investigate those kinds of things here in the United States. I bring those up now because of the scandalous story of the murder of Mr. Duberstein, Mr. Waldo Duberstein. This is a terrible thing because these primary witnesses are just off one after the other when cases begin to be opened up. And it's very hard for researchers like myself and other researchers because the people that we have studied who have important links to these connections get wiped off, and then the people who write the official histories can continue to give you their version because the witnesses who would appear at trials and name other persons or links in these chains of conspiracy are off just before they appear. Now, this last week on the 28th, April 28th, the story over the Associated Press, ex-intelligence aide accused of selling secrets to Libya. He was accused, Waldo H. Duberstein, Dubberstein. He was accused of selling secrets to Libya. The next day, he was dead. But he's an important man. He worked with the CIA from 1947 to 1971, and those were the years after Reinhard Gehlen had got it set up and was working with the CIA, Hitler's intelligence chief. And then Gehlen trained people like Gaddafi that Duberstein was supposed to be working with. He sent Otto Skorzeny down to the Middle East, in all of those countries, Egypt and Libya and Syria and all over the Middle East, to train Nazis directly from the Nazi Germany experiences to get ready for a bloodbath in that particular area and work with the Muslim and the Mormon Brotherhood. This guy was in the CIA from 1947 to 1971. Then he joined the Defense Intelligence Agency. So if he worked with that agency, he worked again with Fritz Kramer, and he worked with Alexander Haig, and he worked with Henry Kissinger in the Defense Intelligence Agency, because all these major operations of Task Force 157, which is Navy intelligence, all go under and work with Defense Intelligence agents. So he was one of the highest people in our government at the highest level, working with a character such as Edwin Wilson, the likes of Edwin Wilson. The front page of the Chronicle had an interesting line. This is the way it says: "It's called a suicide. Man indicted as a spy found shot to death. Third fatality linked to CIA case." Now, isn't that amazing that after all these years, they're finally making some connections that three others, I have some other names linked to that case to share with you, that were killed just when they were about to testify, but they're giving us three at least, and they mentioned Kevin McCullough, who was to testify against Mulcahy, M-U-L-C-A-H-Y, who was to testify against Edwin Wilson, who actually brought him in and was responsible for Wilson's having charges against him, and Rafael Villaverde, V-I-L-L-A-V-E-R-D-E. So this fellow, a shotgun, he's supposed to be sitting in a chair upstairs, then he's found down in a basement. The chair now is moved away from the rest of the house. It's in the basement in Arlington, Virginia. There's a shotgun barrel that evidently they said was put into his mouth, not questioned at all. The police got a telephone call from somewhere saying, "Go check out this house." He was supposed to be at court in the morning, that morning. And so this anonymous call says, "Go check it out." And they go there, and Duberstein is dead. If that isn't a giveaway that it's a murder, I don't know what is. Now, the other witnesses the newspaper mentioned, Kevin Mulcahy. There's a nice story in the National Times out of Australia, October the 11th to November the 6th, 1982. "The man who knew too much." Former CIA official spent years trying to ensure charges were laid against agency renegade Edwin Wilson. Last week, he was found dead under strange circumstances. He feared for his life. He was frightened of Wilson. Remember, Wilson was supposed to be charged with hiring different people to murder 5 people while he was in jail, and nobody mentioned the fact of Mulcahy's being wiped out, or now this Duberstein, this situation. Will anybody link him to that, to his contracts? What kind of power does he have in jail to get rid of these particular people? One article about Kevin McCullough tells how he worked with him at Task Force 157 and with Navy intelligence, and that he was nervous about going public. He said that the FBI had unaccountably conducted a sluggardly investigation. See, the FBI is always a part of this. The CIA was thwarting it. They didn't want an expose of Edwin Wilson. So 1 week before he went to Houston, or just the weekend before he went to Houston, he was offed and locked outside a cabin and was found dead. He was in the company of some females who were never called or interviewed, and probably part of the CIA assassination teams, and Kevin was wiped out. He was afraid he would be. Ted Rubenstein, a researcher up north in the Bay Area, found an article that didn't make the headlines. Another witness that worked with Edwin Wilson: "Death of Soldier of Fortune is puzzling." This is from the Winston-Salem Journal, August the 30th, 1982. This is about a man named William Russell Cranford, C-R-A-N-F-O-R-D. And he worked for the police department in Fayetteville. He was a soldier of fortune. The police said he shot himself in his head. There were 2 bullets in the head, and later they found a third bullet that they thought, well, maybe that was one that he might have shot or tried to commit suicide a year before. On the table next to him when he was dead was 2 of his teeth, but the police couldn't explain how they got there. His brother, Donald, found another gun behind the record player the police hadn't found. Alcohol, tobacco, firearms, Treasury, the FBI entered the case. 3 weeks before his death, he was summoned to New York to a federal grand jury. He was a suspect in blowing up a supermarket. He was photographed preparing the explosives. They believed he was hired by an organized crime family. He was active. He was in Vietnam, active in the U.S. Army for 20 years in the Green Beret, Special Forces, Army Intelligence. He retired from the Army in May 1973 and worked for the police Department, Fayetteville, like I said, South Carolina. He worked for the police department. Then he joined Edwin Wilson and dealt with his assassination hit teams and squads and dealt in his death plans and contracts 1977 to 78. He went to Ecuador in 1979 with a businessman and another member of the Special Forces named Jerry O'Neill. Now, O'Neill was indicted for transporting a submachine gun out of North Carolina that was used for a murder of another friend of his was involved in murdering a person, and this gun was the gun. Crawford's friend Bobby Freer, F-R-E-E-R, from Virginia Beach, Virginia, is now in jail for murdering a person using the gun that O'Neill transported. And I went down to Ecuador under the auspices of a Texas businessman. With business teams, they gave him false passports, they give him ID, they get him through customs. And the point is that all the federal agencies are allowing, I call them these the Odessa killers, to wipe out particular people, bring in guns, bring in drugs. Goodness knows who had the grocery store that was bombed in New York. This was linked to organized crime. Who gives them the passports? How do they get through customs? And he was offered money to go down there in Ecuador, and he called his family. He said, if you don't hear from me in 24 hours, he thought he might be dead or in jail. He came home through Atlanta, and he was okay. But he served the United States Army. He worked with the Army intelligence. He worked with Edwin Wilson. He was down in Ecuador. He's with friends of the killers. He demolishes buildings. He has false passports. But just when he's about to testify at the grand jury in New York, and he worked with Edwin Wilson, he was offed and shot. Another guy that was shot was Mr. Morales, the part of a cloak and dagger operation, Ricardo Monkey Morales. He worked with Edwin Wilson also. And this was an important murder. This guy was sitting in a bar Christmas, just before Christmas, December 1982, and he got a .32 caliber to his head. He worked with the CIA most of his life. Mr. Morales was with the Central Intelligence Agency. He worked with Edwin Wilson and E. Howard Hunt and the anti-Castro Cubans. And just when Wilson is to be brought in and all these scandals are surfacing, all of a sudden, Monkey Morales is wiped out. He used to brag about bombings. He blew up a 1976 Cuban airline where 73 died over Barbados with plastic explosives. He killed the Cuban fencing team, which he says was like the intelligence agency. He fought in the Belgian Congo for the CIA 1963 to 64, where he bragged about killing hundreds of Africans. As a matter of fact, there's a team that was stopped from taking Dominica Island, Dominica, not Dominican Republic, but Dominica, run by the Klan and the Nazi Party from Canada and Kansas and Texas and Houston and Alabama. And and it involved Robert Vesco, and even the name John Connolly came up. And one of the plans was to make it a headquarter for Nazis in Central America and bring in blacks from Africa to hunt and shoot them. I had one article, they were going to chase them, let them loose, and then practice training on people running around on this particular island. Well, Monkey Morales got experience. Now, those are the kinds of teams he worked with. He was in the Belgian Congo, as I say, worked with the CIA 20 years and with Edwin Wilson. And just when he's to testify, he is offed. So Duberstein is one of a lot of them. I'll mention one more. We could do one evening of just these particular people. I often say I have a pile of current deaths in the last, say, 5 or 6 months. I haven't updated. And these are the kind of things of primary witnesses. And the importance of this is that individually they don't mean anything to you and me, and you're not going to remember their names, and I probably won't after a period of time. Some of them I certainly will, but the important thing is that they're all linked to Edwin Wilson, Frank Turple, Theodore Shackley, Thomas Clines, and Samuel Cummings of the CIA, the brother-in-law of Senator John Tower, and Carlos the terrorist, and the people who are killing and bombing individuals, synagogues, spreading terror so that people like Claire Sterling can write a book, The Terror Network. And each one of them worked for our CIA, has worked for them, does work for them. And then after they've done all this killing and they're called as witnesses, then they themselves get killed. I don't feel sorry for Mr. Duberstein. You know, you live by the gun, and not everybody dies by the gun, you know, that gets that nice of one bullet in the head. But the point is that they've played dirty, and they thought, well, they would be immune from all of this, that they're something special. But when it comes time to testify, many of them, of course, part of their job is to be given suicide kits and off themselves. And if they don't, there's somebody to see that it's taken care of. Now, the other person who was murdered was a guy named Villaverde, Rafael Villaverde, Rafael Villaverde. In March of 1982, he was on a ship outside of Miami, that area, when the ship blew up and the body was never seen and he was destroyed. He was about to identify Edwin Wilson's involvement in a plot to kill a Libyan in Egypt. He was over in Switzerland with his cohorts and with Edwin Wilson and was about to testify. Each one of these I've mentioned to you was about to testify, okay? And he was part of an Operation TikToks defendant about narcotics, gun running, murders, CIA, and these are Nazis also with links to Central and South America and European Nazis and Otto Skorzeny. They're not a part of it, and they worked with the special forces that were trained by Hitler's agents. I've done programs on how the Green Berets were set up by men from Nazi Germany who had the expertise for these special forces. He was a key witness against Wilson of the CIA. He was a CIA-trained explosive expert. He was called in to subpoenaed for information on the murder of the Chilean ambassador Orlando Letelier and Ronnie Moffat. He was involved in cocaine traffic in Miami. He was recruited by the CIA 20 years ago, before the Bay of Pigs, and performed a number of, in quotes, missions for the CIA. He trained in demolition. He trained, they say, 100 others, and his name came up at the time that Juberstein died this week. It said in the fall of 82, a Cuban, Rafael Villaverde, who sources said would have testified about Wilson's involvement in an alleged plot to kill the Libyan dissident, died in a boating accident off of Miami. The boat blew up, and that was the end of Villaverde. And then, of course, as I say, there's a whole list. I can continue some more next week, but I think you get the point. When we try to give a view of history, when I try to give an overview of history, it is very hard sometimes to produce. You can't produce dead witnesses, that's impossible. And so people say, where's your evidence? Where's your information? But what they don't know is that the cases are called off because these people are killed. So that we're left with unfinished inquiries, the FBI dragging their feet, the CIA hiring these people, gunning them down and not investigating it. The guy who killed Morales in the bar, no charges. It's just a plain homicide, no charges, and so forth. So the offing of these people is very easy. Nobody checks it up, and they can travel with false identity and be involved with hit teams. All they have their immunity from the CIA, and they go into gun running and narcotics traffic, and they're used for hit teams. That's why when Lucky Luciano of Murder Incorporated was released by Tom Dewey of New York to go to Italy and set up his narcotics operation in exchange for Murder Incorporated moving to Europe and beginning the narcotics traffic in the United States, we could use these killers who the Bay of Pigs people were involved with the Kennedy assassination. Frank Sturgis worked with all these people. We can use them as killers to wipe out witnesses to cases and continue the sequence of killing, whether it's civil rights leaders or labor union people or spokesmen for any organization or writers, newspaper people. They can be offed, and there's so much of it, you can't even be too paranoid in questioning who's going to be next and how is it happening. Just like in the Bay Area, in the last 2 weeks, Senator Burton, Congressman Burton, not Senator, from the House of Representatives, died. He was a terrible opponent of Mr. Watts and the land schemes that he had. And Charles McCabe died, they said, a stroke, a newspaper man who was so anti-Reagan and anti-Watts that he was always hammering away at them. So the two most vocal people against Ronald Reagan and James Watts died 2 weeks apart from apparent heart attack. how do you know what happened until years later when you see an article and somebody confesses maybe that they were part of it? That's the only way you'd ever find out. Well, we're going to take a 1-minute break now and get back. I'm going to go into the Hitler story, the Hitler diary, because I think it's fascinating. And I want to share some ideas with you about that and see what you think about that. Before I do that, I better give the ID and say this is broadcast number 595, and it is May the 2nd. I can't get over that, 1983. And it is KAZU-FM, Pacific Grove, California. I didn't put that on the tape. This is side 2 of the broadcast, so I had to repeat that for the broadcast. Volume 18 of the Warren Commission hearings is a very good one for the formation of the Young Americans for Freedom. And in that volume, they have a list of the early members. It was formed in October 1960 at the home of William Buckley. And the founding members are in that volume, and it is important to read those names because this group were the people that linked to William Buckley of the Central Intelligence Agency and Douglas Caddy, who was at Mullen Associates in Washington, D.C., where the Watergate burglars were hired from with E. Howard Hunt. And again, the anti-Castro Cubans going down to that group that I just mentioned on the first half of the program. Well, some of the early members, the board of directors, are founding members of the Young Americans for Freedom listed in the book. One of them is Strom Thurmond, who later works with Edwin Wilson and Frank Turple, and Jack Anderson has had many articles about his receiving payments from them. And Strom Thurmond was the man who led the crusade, the Holy Crusade, to get John Lennon out of this country. Another person on that founding group was Colonel Charles Willoughby, that famous Nazi, Kurt Wiedenbeck, that I mention every week, who came from Asia and was close to Robert Morris and William and Buckley, and it had his name on there. Another one was Senator John Tower. When Marina Oswald from Minsk, Russia, wanted to come in with her new husband from Navy Intelligence, the papers for her were cleared through the offices of Senator John Tower. And as I say, it's his brother-in-law who runs the weapons supplying operation for this Odessa drug-running narcotic group from the CIA with offices in Monte Carlo, and he's also offices in London and elsewhere. Ronald Reagan was one of the people on this group, the founders of the Young Americans for Freedom. And Mr. Nolan, William Nolan of China Lobby, was part of this group. The group has a lot of military people and congressmen and even people like Igor Cassini. Very political, far right-wing group. But many of those names link up later, not so much later because it was formed in 1960. They link up to the assassination of John Kennedy and the cover-up of John Kennedy. Naturally, none of them are holding the gun, but they all link to the operation that was capable of killing heads of states all over the world, starting in Iran or then continuing with the Dominican Republic and Guatemala and John Kennedy, and then the coup in Brazil. These people stayed together, a lot of them through the years, and are in power today. And the main one who's in power is Ronald Reagan. And next week, I want to read, his early links going back to 1963 to this group and how joyous they were that by 1980 they finally, after all their struggles, had their man in office. But I also want to discuss, because the Hitler diary is in the news now, and Hitler is one of my favorite subjects. I'm not going to do too much on Kennedy tonight. In fact, I may not do more. I do want to spend time on information coming in about the Hitler diaries, because many of you know, and I've referred to that article in the San Jose Mercury last March 28, 1982, the cover of the magazine section, Cal Day. It says, Hitler is alive, and it quotes Mae Brussell and her opinions about Adolf Hitler. And then I've read the other parts. The federal government killed John Lennon. Ronald Reagan is the front man for the forces of evil. That was the front page of a magazine section of the San Jose Mercury, if you could believe it or not. Well, what is the basis for my saying he was alive? Many times I've repeated this, and there's a lot of new listeners, and I'd have no reason to say it. I started studying the Nazi connections to John Kennedy as soon as I opened the testimony of George de Mohrenschildt in Volume 9 of the hearings, and I read backwards or in the middle. I started with Volume 9 and then went to Volume 1. There was an article in Time magazine, May 7th, 1945, on page 70, about the possibility of Hitler's double being burned and that Hitler escaped. And Henry Luce had that in Time magazine. If you want to look that up in the library, I have a copy of that Time, an original copy of that going way back. Then there's a book, UFO Nazi Secret Weapons, and it refers to the Time magazine, and that is a book with a large section. Of course, it's about Antarctica that I talk about so often, and it has the reference to Hitler and the possibility that he escaped. The National Police Gazette that I mentioned, January 1977, that I have copies and can duplicate for you, 50 pages on the escape route of Adolf Hitler. Now, there are many articles in history books about what happened to Hitler, just as there are about what happened to the Romanov family when the Russian Revolution came. But I personally had contact with 3 sources specifically that gave me the idea that I should pursue it further. And one was from a man who had been in Argentina. He didn't say he worked for the CIA. His home base is Monterey Peninsula. I know his family. I was at a party where members of the family were, and the subject, I don't know how it came up about Nazis at the time. It was about 4 or 5 years ago. And the subject of Adolf Hitler came up, and he said that it was common knowledge in Argentina, where he was, of Hitler's survival. And he wasn't shocked at all. He offered, to talk about it. Then the second source was a woman who lives in Los Angeles, who I see now. These aren't just anonymous phone calls I get, and I work on hunches. She originally, she was from the Honduras, and then for a while she lived in Brazil. She married a German man. He lives in the Midwest now. They're still married, but live separately. And she was in Brazil at April 20th, 1968, at the anniversary of Hitler's birthday, when Gustav Franz Wagner, W-A-G-N-E-R, was at that birthday party with the top Nazis from Uruguay, Paraguay, Argentina. They have a party every year in the German colony. And Wagner was caught in a photograph at this party, and he was seen with Hitler. And this person told me that down in Brazil, there was a lot of newspaper articles. A diligent researcher, I've never been able to have the time, or I never thought about it, looking up in the Brazil newspapers what happened the week of April 20th, 1968. She said there were many articles in the newspaper about Hitler and that he was at this party. And that was just passed over. The world press, the Associated Press, United Press didn't pick it up at all. But Mr. Wagner went into hiding. I have some stories, one from the Washington Post, June 22nd, 1979, how he went to the police and asked them to protect him from May 1978, because he was named in the newspaper as one of the Nazis attending the neo-Nazi Congress held to celebrate the birthday of Adolf Hitler. This is Washington Post, June 22nd, 1979, and it tells about his activities there and how he asked the police to protect him. And then October 4th, 1980, there's a story, ex-Nazi officer commits suicide. He was so distraught, again, like our stories that I read before, all these various people that happened to be offed. This poor Wagner, it's like Duberstein, all of a sudden, he commits suicide in the custody of the police. And this story said that there was a newspaper photograph taken at a birthday anniversary party for Hitler near Rio de Janeiro. And this woman lived in Brazil at the time. And then the third person was a man from Amsterdam who was at my home and saw the library of the Nazi books. And he lived with the son of Alfred Rischer, R-I-T-S-C-H-E-R. And Rischer was the man who scouted the Antarctic area for Hitler in 1938 and 39 in case they needed a place to go. And he traveled with him down to Antarctica in 1945 in the boats. They flew out of Germany and then took the boats down to Argentina and Antarctica. So those were my 3 sources. And with that in mind, I look at history and say, well, maybe or maybe not. But I think a person has to ask questions And it's very important. The right questions aren't asked. And as a result, the newspaper people and the authorities are all in a going around in a circle about the Hitler's diary. Didn't he write them or didn't he write them? And the important thing in my mind that I want to share with you now isn't, has he authored them or has he authored half of them? Or did he see any of it or he didn't see any of it? But the story of how they were procured, which is much more interesting to me. We can get to who wrote them later, but how they were procured is the most interesting part. Incidentally, when I left here last Monday night after the broadcast, I went over to the Monterey Institute of Foreign Studies because Eugene Ionesco, Ionesco, was there. He's from France. He wrote The Rhinoceros and The Bald Soprano and other plays, and he's one of my heroes. I love Ionesco's plays. He introduced me to what they call the theater of the absurd. But one of the things that he said that was quoted in the Monterey Herald, he was asked a question which he said he couldn't answer. Just because you write a play doesn't assume that you know all the answers. But Ionesco poses questions. This is what it said in the Monterey Herald in his plays. He does not answer them. And he concluded his speech that evening by saying, we have to live these questions in order to be alive. You have to ask questions in order to be alive. You can't accept everything that you are told or you will die. And to stay alive, you have to ask the questions. You may not know the answers. So go along with the questions about Adolf Hitler and his life, there are a lot of stories that have been concealed about the whole era. In fact, I read last week, I think it was in the New York Times, that 100 million papers on World War II are still locked up as top secret. 100 million. Can you believe that? Goodness knows where they're keeping them. Well, the story that was of interest to me, the first story and the longest and the best, is from the London Times, April 24th, last Sunday. The fellow who went after the diaries is Gert Heidemann, Heidemann, 51 years old, a journalist. He was brought up in Germany. He grew up in Nazi Germany as a child. He's had a hobby of Nazi memorabilia. He collects everything Nazi. He loves it. He raised, according to these stories, £40,000, which is $200,000 in 1973, to buy Field Marshal Hermann Goering's yacht. Now, how did he raise it? Did he get it from Otto Skorzeny? Where did he get it? Who put up the money? That's a question I'd like to know. As soon as he had the yacht, former ex-Nazis began coming to the yacht. The yacht was used, incidentally, by the King and Queen of England, by Queen Juliana of the Netherlands with her Nazi husband, Prince Bernhard, by King Baudouin of the Belgians, Baudouin, who betrayed the Belgians and was knighted by the Vatican, the Sovereign Military Order of Malta. It was used by Konrad Adenauer, and from 1945 until the British returned it to Hermann Goering's widow, Emmy, and then she sold it, and then Heidemann took it over. As soon as he had this yacht, he began to see top Nazis, SS General Karl Wolff, and Karl Wolff is the gentleman written up in those books on the Operation Sunrise. He secretly negotiated the surrender of all the Third Reich forces in South Germany to America. And he was working with Alan Dulles, and Mr. Himmler and SS General Karl Wolff worked in Milan with Walter Rauff, R-A-U-F-F, the head Nazi, the companion of Klaus Barbie, who helped Mr. Pinochet when the CIA put Pinochet in office and killed Salvador Allende. SS Brigadier Fuhrer Wilhelm Mohnke, M-O-H-N-K-E, came to visit him on the yacht. He was the last commander of the Berlin bunker. And a General Hans Bauer, B-A-U-E-R, wrote a book. And it was Mr. Brigadier General Mohnke who told him that there was this aircraft that disappeared that Hitler had sent out, and that some possessions belonged to Hitler were not with the other material that sent out. A plane had crashed. One plane had crashed. So October 15th, 1980, Mr. Heidemann starts out to inquire where this material was. It was written up in a book, but nobody took it seriously for a long time and didn't go after the diaries. But Mr. Heidemann went to the Wehrmacht Information Bureau, that's the German Army Information Bureau, for the details of Germans killed in action. Now, these men weren't killed in action. A plane went down. There were no soldiers or any fighting involved, but they had a record of a plane that crashed 38 years ago, April 21st, 1945. So that he decides to look up the circumstances. He gets the name of the town, and this Mr. Heidemann is on his way. Now, what was flown out of there that he was searching? This is the story from the London Times. Adolf Hitler's birthday, again, April 20th. This is years earlier, 1945. Martin Bormann's at the birthday party, and they have what they call an Operation Seraglio, Seraglio. Pretty Spanish sounding now. They're getting out of Germany. And they decided at Hitler's birthday, let's put the operation in action. And Martin Bormann's a great man. You know, the diaries say Hitler wanted 5 Bormanns, but Bormann made arrangements. He's transferring the Nazi headquarters to Hitler's home in Berchtesgaden. The day after the Fuhrer squadron is to leave, there are 10 planes that go out. 4 go one evening. Plane 3 and 4 aren't described at all. But the Fuhrer squadron is ready to go, and Major Gundelfinger was a part of it. Gundlefinder. Finder, he is the one who was killed. Now, Bormann arranges to take the Reich files and the records for the Third Reich, R-E-I-C-H, out of Berlin. Hermann Goering is in the bunker. Mr. Himmler's in the bunker. They also leave April the 20th. And a General Ferdinand Schroener, Schroener, plans to remain to the end. He says he'll die in the bunker. It wasn't clear if Hitler would leave or not, but Bormann wanted Hitler's escape. And in anticipation that the Fuhrer would leave, his possessions were to be packed up and shipped out. 10 aircraft at that date were already dispatched from Berlin. And then one person, Mr. General Hans Bauer, B-A-U-E-R, he never was on the yacht. He never shows up at the yacht. He was put in a prison in the Soviet Union and got out, and he wrote a book about this later in 1956 called The Missing Plane and Important Papers. He had disappeared. He didn't get to South America. He was picked up by the Soviets because he was important to Hitler. He was one of the important people to the Hitler Air Force Squadron. And the Soviets kept him for a while, and buried in his book was the information or the implication of these diaries. Now, Operation Seraglio was a high-secret plan. As I say, Hitler had 10 aircraft dispatched, and one of them, just one, disappears. 9 went off, but the description of the London Times of what Hitler had in the bunker that they were packing up. Hitler's bedroom in the bunker, there's a small steel safe 4 feet high, 3 feet wide, stuffed to the brim with Hitler's personal papers, files, and letters. There was another file 2 and 3, 2 more in Hitler's bedroom. They were not big enough for everything he had. He had some on the first floor of the Reich Chancellery. He had another safe at number 16 at his private flat in Munich that they had to clear out, and another safe, a steel locker at the Berchtesgaden home up in the hills there that they had to get out. Martin Bormann was to arrange all that. Now, if Mr. von Braun and Mr. Dornberger and the Puneman scientists and Mr. Bormann had been planning for 2 years the escape, it's interesting that all this valuable stuff is collected for 10 planes to get out at this particular time. They've got 10 more days before it's all over, and this is on the 20th. Now, in this list, among the list of possessions, according to a man who was there, in the safes, Hitler had hidden, this is what he says, the membership list of the Nazi Party going back to its earliest days, as well as lists of foreign contributions, the foreign contributions to the Nazi Party and Hitler's supporters abroad. Do you need anything more when you're going out? Bormann has taken all the art and gold out of the continent of Europe. They've taken all the paintings off the walls and shipped them out. They've counterfeited money for a year and a half. They have exited every bank. Every bit of cash in the German banks is out. And Der Fuhrer is sitting with the list of those people that put him in the first place. And 10 plane loads are leaving, and the safes are going to be emptied. And just one plane crashes and burns. But by some miracle, we're supposed to believe that the Fuhrer's diaries are taken by a Wehrmacht officer who doesn't call up the office and say, Der Fuhrer, here's the sealed swastika and the Nazi emblems, you're sealed with letters of Bormann and Fuhrer and Rudolf Hess. And Hess at this point is in prison over in England. He's locked up. A Wehrmacht officer is going to call the headquarters and say, look what I got out of the fire. He would have been promoted. That's a good story. No, but he didn't do that. But the planes leave. And interestingly enough, there was one survivor. And when Mr. Heidemann goes looking for this person, he goes to the town where the plane crashed. He locates the town. He goes to the cemetery. There's 16 German servicemen neatly buried there. One grave says Wilhelm Arndt, A-R-N-D-T. That's Hitler's valet who's carrying these 60 volumes, his precious valet. And Friedrich Goldfinger, Gundlfinger, the pilot, he's dead. And then there's a name Max Fiebes, F-I-E-B-E-S, who's buried there. He's one of Hitler's bodyguard. Well, Mr. Heidemann goes to the record and contacts Leni Fiebes, the widow of one of the men who died. He was a member of the SS. And she gives him the name of one of the rear gunners on the plane, Franz Westermeier, W-E-S-T-E-R-M-E-I-E-R. And he lives in The Hague in Upper Bavaria, and he survived the crash. So this fellow who owns Goering's yacht, who's with Mr. Wolf, SS Karl Wolf, the right-hand man of Klaus Barbie, they take trips together to South America to see Barbie, and we'll do more of that next week. The plane has crashed. The pilot's dead. Hitler's valet is dead. But there's a survivor, Franz Westermeier, and he survives the crash. Now, Mr. Westermeier, this is interesting, in 1953, according to this story, wanted a job. He's a survivor of the Hitler personal possessions, the most loyal troop, the inner entourage of Adolf Hitler with Martin Bormann and Himmler all up there till the last hour. He miraculously survives this plane crash, and in 1953, the Germans opened their newly formed airline, the Lufthansa, Lufthansa, that's going very nicely now. And Hitler's one of his top people from the very last days in the bunker, applies for a job at the newly formed airline, the Lufthansa. He survived this crash. Okay. And when he goes there for the job, who is the man who takes the applications for the new German airline? It's Oberleutnant, the German Oberleutnant Schultz, Schultz. Mr. Schultz is the pilot of the second plane. There were 4 that went out that night, and 1 was crashed. He's the pilot of the second plane who was very important to Adolf Hitler also. Now, when 1953 rolls along, he is hiring for Lufthansa airline. Now, if you want to know how Joseph Mengele or Klaus Barbie or Martin Bormann get in and out of Europe, the stewardesses, can you imagine the pilots he hires, the stewardesses he hires, the truckloads of material that are loaded on planes, the Lufthansa that goes in and out the United States and all over the world? I have to look up the routes now. The Lufthansa, a man who did the hiring when it was newly formed, was one of the 4 pilots that carried the most precious treasures of Adolf Hitler out of the bunker, and a survivor from the plane that blew up is meeting him now to work at the Lufthansa. Now, in April 1980, when Mr. Heidemann locates these people, all of a sudden, Mr. Westermeier dies of cancer. I don't know whether it was a long cancer or whether it was a 3-week cancer like Jack Ruby, or like a shot in the behind and a lingering cancer like Martha Mitchell, where you know she'll die shortly. He dies when the track begins to close in. He just about dies, so Mr. Heidemann doesn't get to see him. But the Lufthansa implications for what you could do for the Odessa, for these people flying in and out, is just horrendous. Now, in his quest for information about the diaries that allegedly were found by the Wehrmacht, this Mr. Heidemann goes to Switzerland, where this is where I was told that Adolf went after he left the birthday party and was recognized that he was in Switzerland. This may be true, but it may not be true, but it certainly is worth asking the question. It reminds me, I brought in just part of a poem by Carl Sandburg that is apropos in The People. Yes, he has a lot of questions about politicians and what kinds of liars they are. He says, who knows the answers, the cold, inviolable truth? And when have the paid and professional liars done none else than bring wrath and fire and wreck and doom? And how few they are who search and hesitate and say, I stand in a whirlpool and tell you I don't know. Yet I have worked out this guess for myself, Sandberg said, as nobody's yes man. And when it happens that I no longer own the priceless little piece of territory under my own hat, so far gone that I can't even do my own guessing for myself, I will know I am one of the unburied dead, one of the moving, walking, stalking, talking, unburied dead. I bring this up because this is the kind of thing that UNESCO talks about publicly and at his speeches, and it's very important, asking the questions. Well, Mr. Heidemann, as I say, goes with S.S. Wolf down to see Klaus Barbie on the excuse for the diary. He's going to see Klaus Barbie for the diary. He would know where the diaries are of Adolf Hitler or what happened to that plane. Now, the cast of characters that I've given you this evening are the interesting thing to me. We'll do more on the diary for a long, long time. They're going to continue it for 30 consecutive weeks. But one of the most interesting parts is the consternation of the historians. They brought in Count Dracula, that Hugh Trevor Roper, who immediately identified this as, yes, this is authentic diary. If any man was brought in to make you question the authenticity, it would be bringing in Hugh Trevor Roper. He was sent by Winston Churchill to identify the remains or the causes of death of Hitler at the end, and he wrote his famous book on the death of Adolf Hitler. And it turned out that after he wrote it and it became the, in quotes, authentic, the bunker wasn't even open for 5 or 6 months afterwards. And Stalin was quoted as saying he didn't believe it, and Churchill didn't believe it, and many historians have not believed that story. But you have a yacht here owned by Goering that is given back, literally given. This man didn't sell bestseller books or goodness knows what. And then the clue is to meet on that yacht with all the top Nazis. And then on the pretext of looking for the plane, or maybe that's what they were doing. But I think the story is bigger. He is with S.S. Wolf and all of Hitler's top agents, and then he's traveling all over the world. Now, he collected Nazi memorabilia. He collected people. He collected top Nazis. As a matter of fact, in New Times magazine, I just have 1 minute, February 1983, it tells about Mr. Wolf, Mr. Ralph, Walter Ralph, from the SS, who was living in South America and working with Pinochet in Chile. And it tells about his working with Mr. Wolf. His job was with Wolf in Milan, Italy, the very city that I was talking about, the gun running and the Nazis and Odessa, the first part of the program. He was part of the Supreme SS and police Fuhrer in Italy was Karl Wolf. And Mr. Ralph was assigned to him in Milan, and they worked together with the OSS and then the CIA. And then years later, they're on this same yacht going down to South America where Ralph and Klaus Barbie are, and Mr. Wolf and Mr. Heidemann. Mr. Heidemann right now, to me, is more interesting than who wrote it, and we'll do a little bit more each week on who wrote it and get back to the John Kennedy story to keep more on that going each week. Meantime, our time is up, so we have to give up the room and the mic at this moment. This is Mae Brussell at KAZU-FM in Pacific Grove, California.